on a stage, controlling minds like a hive. And when I shine a light on the lies, what I find is a play on a stage, controlling minds like a hive. When I was young, I believed what they told me.
Welcome to Tending the Threshold, a multi-part series where we talk about how to come together as things fall apart. We'll be inviting people into the largest conversation of our times, a conversation about anti-racism, decolonization, environmental collapse, late-stage capitalism. And before I go further, I want to do a territorial acknowledgement and say that most of us here are occupiers on Tequilma and Shasta territory in what's so-called Ashland, Oregon. Today we'll be talking about whiteness. The name of the show is Let's Talk About Whiteness. And I'm here with my co-host, Jaime Powell. Jaime, I'm wondering if you could say a couple sentences about yourself.
Sure. My name is Jaime Powell, and I'm the founder of Transformative Arts Collaboration. And I am a social activist and community builder and a transformative artist.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And my name is Holly Truhlar, and I'm a lawyer and a transpersonal therapist. I specifically work with collective grief and trauma, and I also do community building. So to start off the topic, I think it'd be great to just give a definition of what whiteness is. So if we could pull up the graphic that actually defines whiteness, and then I'll read through it with everybody. So whiteness is a social construct that gives unearned power and privilege to people and groups who have white, light-skinned bodies. It allows white-bodied people to define social norms, have disproportionate control over legal, political, and economic systems while lacking racial awareness. So I want to first talk a little bit about what social construct means really quickly. And I think that this is really important because I find that often when we talk about whiteness, white people tend to get really confused and scared and think that we're talking about the skin color white, when really what we're talking about is this social construct. And so a social construct is something that isn't a natural phenomenon. It's a series of agreements, choices, and actions that people make within a society. So I'm curious, Jaime, what comes up for you around that definition?
Well, I really appreciate that definition because so often when opening up the topic of whiteness, of white privilege, of white supremacy, there can be defensiveness in a lot of white-skinned or lighter-skinned people, thinking that it's based in individual actions. You know, lots of times the defense will be, I'm not racist, you know, I don't participate in any racist behavior, but it's really important to see it as a social construct and to see the systemic nature of whiteness and of racism.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I would say for me, one of the things that feels really important about it is really looking at how whiteness has been used to keep us from being liberated, to keep a certain small percentage of people in power. And so for me, there's something about also doing the historical analysis around whiteness and looking at, for instance, Bacon's Rebellion was a time where there was a rebellion of the people who were in the minority. So people who, it was indentured servants who were both white and black, and also the Native Americans, First Nations people, came together, and the rebellion was won by the elites. But what happened was the few people in power, what we might call the 1% now, which were mostly white men at the time, really realized the threat of having these groups come together, and that it really would maybe knock them out of power, out of control. And so that's pretty much why whiteness was created in this country, was to keep those groups apart. And they ended up giving certain rights to white people. Some of the white indentured servants got the right to land and to control different plantations. And so that's, to me, that's really important at looking at what this is, and to say that the definition of whiteness has actually changed over time. Who was accepted in that category has changed. So in the beginning, for instance, Irish people weren't considered white, and now they are, and they've been taken into the fold, and that's a tactic of the powerful elite to keep us separated. So that feels really important to me, and I'm curious if there's any other pieces or additional pieces that feel important to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying and fascinating to really dig into this subject matter and to start to see, that even false medical data was created, falsifying facts that there was a difference between white people, people of color, black people, people from Africa, medically, even in brain size, and different things. The list goes on and on about what was created to solidify this notion of whiteness. And so I'm, again, very grateful to be opening up this topic and this conversation. My hope is that these shows will inspire conversation with the people who are watching, to open up with your friends and your community.
Yeah, and the other piece, I really appreciate that. And the other piece that feels important to me around this is really looking at our liberation, the collective liberation, and saying, I guess there was a turning point for me a few years ago when I realized that this concept of whiteness had been used to keep me from being free too. I'd love to say that a lot of the anti-racism work I do is for other people, or that I'm being charitable, but it's not. Really what happened was I got more information about what whiteness was and how it was being used against me. And it was that self-interest that really drove me to be like, it was this feeling of like, oh, I'm going to rebel against this. Nobody's going to tell me what I can be connected to, and nobody's going to keep me down. And so that opening up that concept and that conversation was really helpful. And I think that it's also important so that white people who are doing this work don't take on that position of being the savior, being the hero that we so often do. And that is one of the characteristics of whiteness, which we'll talk more about that. But it's something that feels really important to me, is that this is really about all of us getting free, and that whiteness keeps us as white people, you and I are both white women, impoverished spiritually and emotionally, and certainly it has really high ramifications on Black, Indigenous, people of color. Physically, of course, there's so much more violence and consequences for those oppressed groups, and it also really impacts our ability to connect with our own bodies and with each other.
Thank you so much for saying that. What are some ways that you've noticed whiteness, racism affecting your personal liberation?
I would say just so many ways. One thing that feels really apparent to me is the way that somatically I'm cut off from myself. And as we go through the characteristics of whiteness, we'll talk a little bit more about it. Yeah. But just really recognizing that I've shut myself down to so many experiences, and I can feel sort of the tension of being raised in a system that really keeps me in check, that really both tells me that I'm superior or I'm elite in a lot of ways, and also at the same time tells me to keep quiet and to keep contained in a lot of ways. So somatically, I notice it a lot. But I'm curious for you, what are some examples that you may have seen or that you've experienced maybe even recently?
Yeah, well, I notice, especially with tone policing, and we'll talk more about the different characteristics of whiteness, but I notice in, even among groups of people that are all white, the tone policing, and in other words, not allowing strong emotion to come, and not even having the capacity really to handle emotionally charged conversations. And I see this happening with white people on white people, but I also see it having devastating effects with white people and people of color. For example, when that leads to calling the police on a black person or a person of color, the ramifications of that are life and death, for a person of color. And so that topic of tone policing, I'm very interested. How do we increase our capacity to have challenging conversations, and how do we learn to de-escalate intense situations by learning how to listen to each other more, rather than having that first impulse to call the cops or to cut each other out of our lives or to fire each other, from workplaces. So how do we increase our capacity? And I see that as a direct effect of whiteness and of racism and of oppression as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. There was a couple things that I kind of want to pick up the thread here.
Yeah.
One is really defining tone policing. And because I think for some people it's pretty obvious, but it's this idea that something needs to be said a really particular way, or, yeah, that was too emotional, so I couldn't get it. And you have to say it like this for it to be valid. Mm-hmm. And I see this happen all the time in different circles, and especially in Ashland. And one of the ways I've seen it happen quite a bit in Ashland is this idea, for example, like, this, you have to say this in nonviolent communication terms, mm-hmm. which is a really specific form of communication. And like, if you're not using nonviolent communication, then it's your fault that I'm dysregulated. And so, nonviolent communication is a great tool in a lot of ways, and it's really culturally assumptive. And to have this idea that unless someone says something the way that I want it to be said, then it's not important or it's not real. That's a form of tone policing. Yeah. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up, but also this idea of, this thing of calling the cops. And, mm-hmm. Lately it's come out a lot, and I think this has been happening for a really long time, but because of social media, we're becoming more and more aware of the ways in which white people end up calling the cops on people of color, particularly black people, for basically being black. And so there's been really recent examples of people calling the police on black people who are having a barbecue, black people who are sleeping on the couch in their own dorm. Mm-hmm. And you're right, the effects of that for a person of color, having the police called often will put them in a down power position for sure, mm-hmm. but sometimes a really scary, violent position, because police bodies have been trained in a certain way that can be have really horrific consequences. And so really emphasizing here that people should not be calling 911, particularly on people with oppressed identities, unless there is bodily harm or death that's going to happen to their body or someone else's body in the area. And so really getting clear about when it is okay to call the cops and not, and when that would be a good thing to do.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's so much more for us to cover in the realms of whiteness and how to spot it in ourselves, and what to do about deconstructing whiteness.
Well, and so I think this is a great time to bring up the common characteristics of whiteness. So if we could bring up the graphic that talks about what are the common characteristics of whiteness, and we'll read it. I'll read it as it's up there. Common characteristics of whiteness include superiority, domination, denial, self-centeredness, seeming fragility, hastiness, emphasizing productivity, assumed rightness, and entitlement. So I think it's important to outline this. And there's other characteristics too that we can go into or not, and maybe we'll bring up some examples if they come up. But I think it's important to really look at what could this look like. And I want to be really clear right now in this show, we are centering whiteness. And the goal is to often decenter whiteness, but when we're consciously centering it, we're doing that in order to betray it. So that's why we're doing this. And I'm curious what your thoughts are as I was reading off those characteristics. What are your experiences with that? Do you have any additional ones that you want to bring up? Anything?
Yeah, thank you again. It reminds me of my time at Standing Rock, going to Standing Rock to participate in with the First Nations people, and I got an opportunity to work in the medic yurt as a massage therapist. But in order to be there, there was a strong request from the Native people to go through an Indigenous-led training of how for, especially for white people, to enter into that space and allow the Indigenous people to lead. And so that training was really powerful, and then going to actually work in the medic area was also additionally powerful and required another training. What I noticed is that occasionally there would be people who showed up on the scene without going through the training. And so it was one of the first times that I could see whiteness, for example, taking ownership, like just kind of coming on the scene and taking ownership is something for me that I've been prized to do as a white person. Like, yeah, go in there, take ownership. But in an Indigenous-led movement, people have been there for a long time and know what they're doing. And there's a beautiful and intricate and exquisite system of how things work and how things operate. And so for me, it was the first time I got to see myself and other people kind of busting on the scene and coming to take over when there was already protocol in place and already wisdom of the elders that was guiding that scene. So that was one example on that list that I saw within myself and I saw within other people who are affected and operate through the lens of whiteness.
Yeah, I really appreciate that example. And for me, like one of the words that comes up that we had outlined here is entitlement too, right? I see this and I've noticed this in myself, this idea that I should just get access to things, because that's been my experience most of my life. Of course, I'm a woman, which is more of an oppressed identity. And so there are some things that I've had to work a little harder for, haven't had access to as a woman, but for the most part, I'm a very privileged white woman. And so I get access to most places. And this idea that, oh, maybe all the spaces aren't mine, or maybe that wisdom isn't mine and I either have to earn it or it's never gonna be mine. And I remember years ago in my life, that feeling really offensive when that's the experience for a lot of people, and it actually makes a lot of sense that not everything is mine. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that example, such a great example of that. And I'm curious if you have any others that feel really pertinent as far as your own experience or anything that you want to share.
Yeah, I'm just laughing because before the show we were like, oh, there's so many examples to share of blunders or mistakes along the way of dismantling racism, learning more. And one is very recent. I had the honor of working with Ashland High School students earlier this year. Two of the students engaged in some hate speech on social media, and the school, really responded quickly to wanting to bring in some education and wanting to bring in conversation and dialogue. And there was an opportunity to have a conversation with the Black Student Union there at Ashland High School about why it's not okay for white people to use the N-word. It's kind of shocking that in this day and age we would need to be educated about why it's not okay to use the N-word as a white person. But however, that topic needed to be addressed. And so for me as an adult, I was really excited that that conversation was happening here in Ashland, that we were having an opportunity to pull the veils back, to kind of pull the carpet back and see the dust that's under the rug, the dirt. And so I got on the email and I invited a lot of people in the community I thought would be helpful in this conversation. And immediately, Libre Corey, who is an amazing teacher at Ashland High School and the representative, the ally for the Black Student Union, let me know the students in the Black Student Union are not wanting this to be a large conversation. This is a very vulnerable topic. We're wanting to keep it very intimate because there's huge feelings that come up with this. And so as a white person, I realized that I could have had the tendency to just bulldoze over people's feelings, over what was actually being called for. And the word iatrogenic really came to the surface. Iatrogenic is a word I just learned through trauma work, which is that which is intended to do good actually does harm. And so there I was in a situation, and I had an opportunity to put another email back to all the people I'd written the email to and say, thank you for receiving that email, but actually the students of the Black Student Union would rather this to be a more intimate conversation, to have a more intimate conversation with other white students about why it's not okay to use the N-word for white students. So that's one example of a mistake that I made along the way, but I also feel like this work is messy, and we will make mistakes along the way, and we will need to also own those mistakes in order to learn and move forward.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. All of this, one of the things that I really just love about working with you and being on this show together is your ability to really be like, I'm learning, this is messy, we're not going to do this perfectly. One of the other sort of characteristics of whiteness is perfectionism, and this idea that like, if I don't do it perfectly, if I'm embarrassed or anything, then I just can't do it. And so I know, like when we brought up doing this series, I was like, I want to do a show about whiteness. And you were like, yeah, right on. And this is my jam. And so I really appreciate it, because it can be scary and it's so needed. And so like, I appreciate that framework of we're learning. Like, I'm still learning. There's probably going to be things about this episode that either of us are like, ooh, wish we would have covered this, or maybe we could have said that better. But just that idea that we're students, and I bring up quite frequently that part of my practice is the path of humility, like the willingness to be humiliated and really expose myself, and oftentimes apologize and move forward in that way. So I love the way that you operate in that. And I'm sure we could talk so much more about examples and ways that this show up, but I also do want to talk a little bit about how we can move against whiteness, abolish whiteness, betray whiteness, and heal. And so one of my questions for you is, like, what are the best and most promising practices that you've found for working with this or against this and healing this?
Well, so I feel extremely grateful to have lived in North Carolina for 12 years and to have been in that community of really progressive social justice activists, such as Michelle Johnson and Vivette Jeffries-Logan, Tema Okun. There's just some amazing hearts and minds that are there, and they have a training, or had a training, called Dismantling Racism Works. And what I know is that as a woman of privilege, a white woman, that it's possible to live my whole life from birth to grave without entering into this study. Like, I don't have to do this work. However, my heart and my soul and my liberation tell me that I need to. So what I'm trying to convey is that it takes an extra effort to step out of one's bubble and research these trainings. Here in Ashland, we have the Racial Equity Coalition. There's also SURGE, Standing Up for Racial Justice. There's several different chapters, Black Lives Matter, ways to educate ourselves, but it does take stepping out of our bubble, stepping out of our comfort zone, and being willing to enter into a messy study where I get to see my shadows. And for me, that's what I'm here on this planet to do, is to shine that light of liberation in all the nooks and crannies, like that.
Yeah, and you do that. I really appreciate that about you. You're working it. You're sitting in the fire, and I like having people that sit in the fire with me. So I would say for me, some of the things that have been the most helpful, I'm enrolled in 2 liberation schools. One is ran by a Black woman named Desiree Adaway, who's amazing. And her website is, I think, DesireeAdaway.com. And then another one is called Liberation Spring, and that's ran by Anjali Nath. And both very amazing learning that, yeah, I've gone out of my way to be a part of. And then I also, I sort of started doing some of this work just by reading different people of color authors, particularly Black women. And so I would say, like, anything written by Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, go for it. I love that stuff. And then Adrienne Marie Brown is an author. She wrote Emergent Strategy, and so that's another really great resource. And then, like, you and I think are fairly available if people want someone to talk to about this. And then I know in the next episode we'll be talking a little bit more about appropriation and looking into our ancestry, and that's been a big practice of mine too that we can talk a little bit about next time as well. So I'm curious if there's anything else you want to say, and then maybe taking us into the outro and the rest of our time.
Yeah, I want to just continually express gratitude to be able to have these conversations. I know that for some of you watching, this may be very sensitive information, maybe very, very challenging to watch or to take in, and I want to say that it was for me and still continues to be very sensitive as well. So be gentle, I want to say to myself and to you and to all of our listeners and watchers. And also the times are urgent and the times are necessary to do this work right here and now. So thank you for watching, and this episode is about, let's talk about whiteness, and it's part of a larger conversation called Tending the Threshold. And our next episode will be going in a little bit more deeply about cultural appropriation, and we have an amazing guest, Louise Perret. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next episodes. Bye for now.
When I was young, I believed what they told me. And when I was young, they really tried to mold me. But then somehow I knew it wasn't true. They were confused, I had a clue within my soul that led me to a higher truth. But then somehow I knew it wasn't true. I was confused, I had a clue within my soul that led me to a higher truth. When I was young, I was told the greatest story.